I'm not going to have any PowerPoints to entertain you. I am reluctant sometimes to use it. I was recently asked to go to Madrid for an international conference by the International Bar Association and talk about climate change for an hour and a half, only to find that my slide machine that they had brought and put up there did not operate, so I had to go without that for an hour and a half. And after that, I've been rather selective about when I chose to use those. I think one of the things that we need to put in context here is the interrelationship and the difference between a couple of terms we've talked about, resiliency and sustainability. Resiliency really refers to the capacity of a building or a system or a city or a corporation, a town, a nation, whatever, to deal with chronic stressors and sudden stressors, sudden dramatic stressors. These could be earthquakes, they could be fires, flooding, climate change or something of that nature, riots, terrorism, etc. So those were the context in which we looked at the city of Boston, the study that Ali just mentioned earlier. Sustainability is a more fluid term in different people's minds. It often is referred to as when you make decisions in terms of structures or buildings or technology, that you look at the near-term and the long-term impacts of what you're doing in terms of the utilization of resources and its impact on the greater environment. Kind of reminds me in a sense of the Navajo concept of walking in beauty way, where it's your responsibility to try to live and act in a way that's in harmony with not just yourself and your family and your immediate group around you, but with the broader universe of the earth and its environment and the universe in a sense. So that is closer to sustainability as I understand it. Sustainability is often referred to also, they talk about in the context of the three bottom lines, the environment, the economy, and social issues. So when we went and looked at these issues, it was an evolving issue for the U.S. Green Building Council. I was on its legal advisory committee for a long time and have consulted with it over many years on a variety of issues. And in 2016, the U.S. Green Building Council began to put out drafts of its proposed pilot program for Lead for Cities. And I met with some of the people involved steering that in D.C. And out of that grew the request that my company, E-Cubed, become involved in and undertake a resiliency case study with the city of Boston, which we did. And in that case study, we looked at 16 different criteria for resiliency. They included everything from the built environment that was horizontal, the built environment that was vertical, the issues of climate change, the issue of energy, schools, hospitals, education, social equity issues, and everything else that kind of goes into whether or not a city is going to be resilient. And those kind of issues, I think, are really reflective of what corporations might find if they examine their own issues of resilience, their capacity to recover. And in a sense, it relates to the city's infrastructure on an individual basis as well. It was a case study that resulted in a presentation, as Ali mentioned, to the U.S. Green Building Council's Green Build in November of last year. And the written case study was provided to the City of Boston and has now been released and published by the U.S. Green Building Council in July 17th of this year. In doing that, the U.S. Green Building Council press release, I just read one sentence from that from Raj, who is the president and CEO. And he said, and we know now that in order to realize a sustainable future for all, the next generation of green buildings must focus on the development of smart and resilient cities and communities, and you could say buildings as well. Now, when you look at these kinds of issues, typically the focus for a lot of people involved in the green building movement has been on environmental issues and the idea that you wanted to create a building that was environmentally sound, both in terms of how it impacted the community around it during construction and operation or occupancy. And energy became a huge component of, obviously, because you can't do anything significant in energy without impacting the environment. But it also has social implications as well. And the two of them are so interrelated that I think it's right to say that if you build the best sustainable building in the world, that is a platinum LEED building, that is a net zero building, that has all the greatest technology there, and it collapses in an earthquake, What have you really accomplished there from a sustainability standpoint? And I suggest to you that those buildings may pose unique and more hazardous conditions to the public, environmental and otherwise, than you'd find even in some of the older buildings. The USGBC, when it became aware, I became aware, and then the USGBC became aware of AB 2681, and we understood what that was about in seismic resiliency. We focused on that issue and talked about it. They asked me to come out and testify in strong support of that particular piece of legislation. And one of the things that we looked at there in coming to that conclusion was the impact of those buildings if they collapsed on the environment. And when we looked at some of the projections for the big earthquake, which is viewed as being inevitable, and many times, 10 times I've seen, 50 times greater potentially than the Northridge earthquake, the devastation that would cause is astronomical. The first speaker talked about the legal and the human implications in that in terms of the disaster of that, and those are, not to be overlooked. They are extraordinarily painful to think about. But when you look at the rubble that would collapse because of that, and the impact on the economy, the impact on the environment, that is also very, very significant. Many of those buildings, as we all know, have asbestos in them, and they have other toxic chemicals. And if you ever looked at the theories of one fiber causing mesothelioma, on the concept that thousands of buildings could collapse and release asbestos into the air, into the soil, into the water around us, is just extraordinarily difficult to cope with. If you look at the amount of rubble that would be produced, we looked at some of the estimates on that, and we came away with with estimates that were given to us by governmental entities that the rubble alone from that kind of collapse could fill every landfill in the state of California and possibly every landfill across the country. And then you add to that the amount of energy and environmental impact that moving that kind of rubble around to dispose of it would have. That's another significant environmentally negative impact. And then refabricating the steel, the cement, and everything else, that's another environmental impact. Look at the economic impact that would have in terms of dislocation of people and businesses across the state of California. And I have to tell you that alone is just an extraordinary reason to move more aggressively on seismic resiliency. And those people that don't have a job to go to because the buildings collapsed and don't have a home to go to, that human suffering is significant. Not long ago, many of you probably read in the LA Times about the state of Arizona deciding that it was going to hold a particular workshop across the state on how to deal with the possibility of having to deal with as many as 400,000 immigrants from California to Arizona in the event of that kind of earthquake. And I think that number underestimates what the true migratory and human hardship would be. So it really is clear to me that we really need to look at these things in great depth. It is a very, very significant problem that is facing this country in the United States. It's not something we can wait until it happens before we do something to try to become resilient. We just can't afford to take that kind of risk, and I think that's grossly irresponsible. And it was for that reason that the U.S. Green Building Council asked me to testify before the Assembly and the Senate in their behalf. And they place this as a very high priority item. I think what you're going to see from the U.S. Green Building Council in terms of sustainability issues, you're going to see resiliency being more and more woven into the green building structures and mandates because of this greater recognition of the significance of that. In California, what we're looking at is earthquakes primarily, as well as some sea rise. But in other places, Boston was looking at flooding and seawater rising as well, but other states have hurricanes, tornadoes, etc. And so it's just not a California issue. It's an issue that all of us need to take very seriously and start doing something about it as quickly as possible. So that pretty much winds up what I would like to say in behalf of the U.S. Green Building Council and myself on it. And it would be hard for me to understate what I consider to be, and the Green Building Council considers to be, the very, very serious risk that we need to all work together to address. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we wrap up your presentation, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions. I know most of us know about U.S. Green Building Councils. For those of us that don't know, can you please tell us who U.S. Green Building Council
Sure.
is and their membership and kind of their strength?
Sure, I'll be happy to. The U.S. Green Building Council actually started in a meeting at a sort of a hotel, motel kind of stuff with a number of architects and engineers who basically were concerned that the buildings they were designing, the buildings they were building, were having negative impacts on the environment and on the people that occupied them. And so the idea was to try to develop something in terms of a standard that would help move and motivate cities and the industry to build safer, more environmentally friendly buildings. They recognized that energy was a significant component of that. And so they added energy and emphasized more and more about that as they began to understand that energy was a significant impact on both the environment and on social issues as well. It's sort of, you know, one of the problems I think all of us have who are people who dedicate their life to a particular profession, whether it happens to be law or architecture or whatever it happens to be, is we become silo thinkers. We tend to look upon issues within the mainframe and the confines of our own professional background. And that is a real danger in terms of addressing complex problems. It reminds me, my wife, when I got married many years ago, who's a very much brighter than I am and a psychologist, gave me a wedding present. And that wedding present is a picture, and on it is a statement from Oliver Wendell Holmes. Oliver Wendell Holmes was on our Supreme Court from around, I think it was 1906 to 1932. And a good friend of his was embarrassed because his son kept trying to pass the state bar, was not able to pass the bar, kept failing. And I think it was on the sixth attempt he finally passed the bar. And so he wrote to Holmes, and he was on the court then, and he said, "I'm so proud. My son has now passed the bar, and he began to sharpen his mind with the practice of law." And Oliver Wendell Holmes very astutely wrote back, he said, "Well, congratulations on your son passing the bar, but my experience is that the practice of law sharpens a man's," at that time would be men, "mind by making it like a pencil, smaller as we go on." And so that was to remind me to think beyond the box of just being a lawyer. But I think that's something all of us need to do, and it's something the U.S. Green Building Council has done as it begins to network now and understand the depth of resiliency and how that impacts it. And as they do these programs each year, they look at it again and they try to decide, where have we gone as an industry? Where are we now in terms of our performance and these standards? And what can we do to raise the bar a little bit further to help motivate us all to go forward? So that's really what they're about. There are about 13,000 businesses, maybe more than that now, that have joined the U.S. Green Building Council. And it's through those business organizations that their employees, which you can multiply by hundreds on top of that, so it's hundreds of thousands of people are involved in the green building movement now through the U.S. Green Building Council, which has now gone international as well.
And you represented the U.S. Green Building Council in D.C., from D.C., because they're based in D.C.,
yes, right.
But they have many chapters all over the United States.
All across the United States and throughout Europe, the Middle East, Asia, South America, around the globe.
So this is not just a non-profit or advocacy group, but it's really a major business association that represents.
It is set up as a association that people belong to through the businesses that employ them.
And it makes sense, Les, that if no matter how green a building is, if it doesn't stand in an event of some type of a disaster, it could be earthquake, it could be tornado, or it could, be any flooding and so on. So if it cannot stand, it really doesn't matter how green it is. So do you think it's possible that we see U.S. Green Building Council, which is famous for its LEED certification of different degrees,
yes,
and to include some of these resiliency criteria as part of their measuring the degree of
I think that's definitely going to be happening. We now are including it They are including it, the organization is included in the lead for cities. And when we first looked on it, the idea was to put just one more of the multiple kind of criteria for lead for cities in there as resiliency. And after the presentation discussions that happened last year in November and discussions that occurred during this year, that's viewed as not adequate. And so you're going to see more and more of that. I think you're going to see some emphasis of that in the this coming November. The U.S. Green Building Council will have its annual conference again, and it's going to be building in nature. It's going to talk about the relationship between the two. So it's understanding of what green really means, sustainability means, and resiliency meaning is expanding. And so I think you're going to find it growing over the years too, not just this year, but going forward.
Let's thank you very much for your presentation.